I'm J. Carl Ganter. I'm a director and co-founder of Circle of Blue. I'm a journalist and photographer. I run a team of reporters, data researchers, and photographers reporting on global freshwater issues, and particularly the nexus, the competition between water, food, and energy. And so a couple of housekeeping notes too. Let me just do this here so I don't forget. Okay, silence cell phones. Anybody have any noisy cell phones? Great ringtones. We can hear them later. We can share them. Let's see, again, mentioning that this session is being streamed to another theater as well, so just want to remind you of that. Also, when the microphone, the square thing, and we also have a handheld microphone too, when it comes to you and you have a question or comment, you want to speak into, there's a little X at the top, so you actually speak into the X.
Oh!
Ooh. Oops, and sorry, I spilled
It is
the water.
waterproof too,
Yeah,
by the
it's
way.
appropriate, Carl.
We actually staged that. Get the sanitation crew in here.
We had that too, didn't we?
This is a tough crowd, as you can tell already. So then after the session, there are session surveys here. You can fill them out now, just circle 5s or whatever. Also, when you do ask questions, we love short questions, not expositions, and your name and what organization you're from, okay? We're also going to run the session. We're going to do I'm going to set it up. I'm going to take us around the world, and then we'll go to our panelists. We'll talk about how do we collaborate in this space? How do we collaborate tenaciously? Maybe it's tenacious. Is it tenacious passion? No, tenacious, fierce
compassion.
Fierce compassion, tenacious water.
There
we go. Okay. So anyway, again, I'm Carl Ganter. Let me just introduce our panel here. We have Gary White from Water.org. We have Neil Jeffrey. Now, do you prefer what's up?
You can do either. That's fine.
Okay.
What's up?
What's up? It's
Which
an app.
stands for?
No, water sanitation for the urban poor.
Fantastic.
And with Water for People, we have Eleanor. So we have a great lineup here. So before we actually run through and get into our conversation, I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and take you on a little round-the-world journey of my itinerary, which I'm chasing Gary and these guys. They have far more miles than I do, but I try to catch up. So I didn't go to Mars, but how many of you saw The Martian? Almost everybody. Well, that's your assignment for the trip home, okay? So because as we all know, Matt Damon's number one first step was to manage his water, was to actually figure out how he was going to grow food, which was based on his on water, his water supply. So as we saw yesterday, as Al Gore, how many people were in the session yesterday? Almost everybody. Anybody not? Okay. So in the new version of Inconvenient Truth, he didn't say Houston, but Houston, yes, we do have a problem here on the water planet. So most of you have probably seen a slide like this, how much percentage of the earth is actually fresh water, et cetera. It's just really important perspective to know that it's a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of water that we're actually talking about here today. So we're talking about water for the population and urban supply. We're talking about rural supply and contamination. This is in Tehuacan, Mexico, little tastes of stories that we've done around the world. This goes here. We're talking about water for agriculture. The biggest single user for water is agriculture. And if any of us in the water space look at this picture, there are actually metaphors literally dripping out of the image here. They're using groundwater for flooded irrigation, and that's groundwater that's pumped 24 hours, 7 days a week because of bad policy, which allows farmers to have free electricity and run their pumps 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. His pump is actually hardwired, never turns off. Great way to drain your aquifers in a hurry. So replumbing the planet. Huge infrastructure projects underway all around the world. This is the South North Water Transfer Project in China, moving water from the Yangtze north to Beijing, and a new line going west and northwest for mining coal. So water used, of course, for a lot of industrial processes. Coal mining, huge challenge in China. They don't have enough water to continue, mining and processing coal at current rates. We also have some huge changing assumptions happening. This was 2 years ago, the base of the Himalayas in India, where 8 dams failed over a 2-day period. 30,000 people died in little villages throughout this entire region. We sent a reporter and photographer there. They were able to come back with this picture. This is a 30-meter high dam. It took them 6 months to dig the turbines out. So the glaciers are surging, so it's much harder to actually predict our water supplies and also our energy supplies, because these were also designed to generate power. Climate change, we heard a lot about climate change a couple weeks ago. Is at the Mekong, the delta of the Mekong River. Salinity is pushed now 78 kilometers upriver, so climate change is meeting our water supplies abruptly at our coastlines. Huge, huge issue. And as Al Gore mentioned yesterday, the World Economic Forum last year ranked water as the #1 risk of greatest impact. This year, we actually went up a notch to the #1 risk, yeah, great, the #1 risk of the decade. So water crisis, but actually, a couple years ago, we got this change. That E is there, we changed that from an I. So water crises, not just crisis. It used to be just crisis. And this is why. Water insecurity pressure points around the world. Sorry, this is impossible to read, but just gives you an idea of how many different points and intersections there are. Geopolitical risk, tensions, groundwater issues. These are the places that we're watching on our news desk. Some good news, yes, have to balance this with some good news. Some real, and I hope we'll talk about this a little bit more today, the Sustainable Development Goals. Yes, water, #6, there we are. And water runs through how many? Almost all of the others, right?
Yeah, there's 7 of them.
So huge, huge breakthrough finally for the Sustainable Development Goals, basically setting our compass for the next generation. Big change too we're seeing is understanding systemic risk and responses. So at the Economic Forum also they do these kind of cool maps to show where we fit in the picture. Well, that's another thing that's happening now that's rare, I think, is understanding systems thinking. How many people have been hearing that term a lot more in the last couple of years, right? So we're actually understanding where we are. It's the relevancy, where this is the whole theme of breaking down silos. So you have all these other cheerful things like spread of infectious diseases, Zika, there we go, extreme weather events, failure of urban planning, profound social instability. It's all connected, and water's right at the center of them. But this whole idea of systemic thinking. A couple quick points that these guys really focus on here is, how do we use water for empowerment, water sanitation, for health and education and equity. This is actually in Manila, in a slum in Manila, a poor area. Toilet pride. Anybody met Jack Ma? Not Jack Ma.
Jack Sim.
Jack Sim. Sorry, Jack Ma. You can buy toilets for Jack Ma online, probably. Jack Sim. So, it's the World Toilet Day. It's his. We can celebrate the WTO. Toilet pride. Another big thing that we're seeing too, and it really applies as we're talking about these issues, is the political risk of inaction. In my home state, Michigan, political risk of inaction. We have a governor whose job is on the line for basically malfeasance or misfeasance or just pure ignoring water supply and infrastructure. Value of water, another big story. How do we actually value our water? What kind of policies? What kind of, how do we build trust? How do we actually share our water? And me as a journalist, hey, it's news. It is right now. It's actually in the news. It's taken us 10 years to get on the front pages to basically bust through. So with all of that, it's been a tumultuous kind of 10 years. It's been some big changes. And I wanted you guys to first tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do. And I want to come back to Gary to set us up because, what do you say? Are you the senior official on the stage here?
Some longevity.
Yeah. But to give us an idea what it was like 10 years ago in the wild west of water, and then where we are now. But first, let's just do some quick introductions. Start Gary, and we'll come back.
So Gary White, CEO and co-founder of Water.org, and as Carl's kind of alluded to, I've been doing this for a while, I guess since I was an undergrad, and co-founded Water Partners in 1990, and then we merged with The Martian, Matt Damon's organization, H2O Africa, in 2009, and then Matt and I formed Water.org. This overview is fantastic, Carl, and I think it really sets the context well for this, because where Water.org kind of drills down into this is really around the equity issue. Our thesis is that these macro issues are incredibly important and they need to be addressed, but there's enough enfranchised people that are going to make sure that water flows into cities, and because that's where the wealthy people live. Our job is to make sure that we can keep a level playing field for the poor, so that when these resources are made available, the poor get equal opportunity to access them as well. And we do that primarily by assuming that the poor have this intrinsic power as customers, because they're already paying huge amounts of cash for their water and time, spending time collecting water. So we help them kind of redirect those resources by getting a loan, and then using those saved resources to repay those loans, and to get water connections, to build toilets, to buy water filters, and so on. So that's really where we come from with our water credit initiative, and then moving further into also providing social impact capital through a new initiative we call Water Capital, where we're raising social impact investments from investors in the US and Europe, and then reallocating that as debt to our partners so that they can provide microloans to people to get these services.
Great. Neil, you want to tell us a little bit more about what's up?
Sure, absolutely. So in comparison with Gary, I'm the new kid on the block. So I've been running WASSUP for the last 2 years. WASSUP is an organization that is 10 years old, and some of you may know Sam Parker, who was the founder. I was deliberately taken on as the second stage CEO to grow the organization and to put in place the systems and processes so that we could be effective at a global scale in terms of seeking system change regarding the water delivery system that Gary was talking about. WASSUP works from the perspective of building the global system of utilities and other service providers. We work with both public and private sector providers to make sure that system is more effective. We work specifically in urban context in emerging markets, so the folks who want to access services that Gary was talking about have better service provision and it's more effective. We deeply care about the fact that the provision for the poorest consumers is better, but if we can build the quality of the entire system, then we see that as being very positive. And we're deliberately a hybrid organization between for-profits and non-profits, and we work with a whole bunch of companies that sell products like Unilever, who sells soap, Borealis and Bruges, who sell much better pipes, and if we can help them to make more profit whilst achieving social impact and whilst building the capacity of utilities like Nairobi Water, Lusaka Water, Jurama in Madagascar, then we see that as a real positive, because that's about building sustainability of the system. We deliberately chose to go deep in 6 markets, which are Bangladesh, Kenya, Ghana, Madagascar, Mozambique, and Zambia. And for us, that's the testing ground of how we get the long-term relationships right, so that we understand the processes that are required to build that system. And then we've now put in place a mechanism through a consultancy service to take that to other markets. And that consultancy service is now advising on major governmental shifts in countries such as Ethiopia, India, Sierra Leone and Pakistan. And when we get into the debate, I think we can talk about how the action from our side will then really works alongside and helps to assist the activities that Gary was talking about.
Great. Okay, great. Thanks. Eleanor.
I'm Eleanor from Water for People. And Water for People, we have touch points with both Gary and Neil. We work in rural areas principally, and we bring water to people through our model is working with the communities and local governments at the hardest to reach, working to get water to every family, clinic, and school, but not only building the infrastructure, building the people who can operate and maintain the systems. So it's about institution building, capacity building, teaching them how to set the rates, what you need for operation and maintenance, how you get spare parts, supply chain set up. We definitely work with microcredit for all the reasons Gary just described. And we're encroaching in peri-urban areas, so coming into where Neil works with WASSUP. In sanitation, since we're very rural, it's on-site sanitation, no sewers, probably never sewers, pit latrines and toilets. So really making that a business venture. Bringing entrepreneurs in to sell toilets and septic tanks and empty your pit and bring it to a sludge treatment plant, which those are not so common, but we're building them, and then repurposing sludge for profit, fuel, biofuels. Fertilizer, compost, et cetera. So building a whole new business model and a whole new group of entrepreneurs in sanitation. So we work, as I said, with at the localist level with 4 million people. We're growing that to 7 million people in Africa, Latin America, and India, just staying in the same countries. And then we're also beginning to work at the national level, helping national government have a framework that can really get to SDG 6, which is availability management of water and sanitation for all. And that's more of a advisory consultant role, just learning, bringing what we know and helping leverage that into a national. And that's what we do. And a little bit, I guess, about me.
Yeah, sure.
I'm a water person my whole life, a little bit different than Neil and Gary. So I started in civil engineering, well, like Gary. I started early in my career doing consulting, left and did development for a while, then worked my whole career in big water, what I call super urban systems all over the world, ran a global water business, but very big scale. And then I've come full circle to small water, but I feel like it's much more impactful and a greater need. And I joined Water for People last summer.
Awesome. Well, so talking about frameworks and things, well, what was in the picture frame 10 years ago? What did it look like? That's about when I started in this about 15 years ago.
Well, I think for me, it may be a little hard to distinguish what was 10 years ago versus 20. So maybe I'll. It's like, when did that thing happen? I mean, what I know is that a decade or two ago, there really weren't a lot of NGOs focused on water. In fact, Water for People, Waterorg, and Water.org were really kind of the three that were focused on this. And now what's different is like there's hundreds, if not thousands, of water NGOs that have started up to attack the problem. And I think that's one thing that's different, the whole landscape in terms of different solutions. I think the other thing is that the good news is, I guess, that since 1990, more than 2 billion people have gotten access to water and sanitation for the first time, and to water at least. And I think that strongly correlates with the fact that more than 2 billion people have been lifted out of absolute poverty. So I think while us as NGOs have done, something to contribute to that, I think far more of that is attributed to understanding that people being lifted out of poverty, one of the first things they want to do is improve their water and sanitation service, and they'll put their money into it. I think that's kind of a corollary to what's been happening in terms of recognizing that there are these huge coping costs that go into poor people getting their water and sanitation every day, in terms of the time lost collecting water, time spent or money spent on vendors paying 10 to 12 times more per liter than if they were connected. So the concept that the macroeconomics of this, we can work with that. We can work within the slipstream of natural forces for the market and really come to solutions. And I think we wouldn't have been talking about social entrepreneurs or small and medium enterprises as businesses serving this need 10 years ago, because the assumption would have been, those 2.5 billion without sanitation and, back then the billion without water were all equally poor and all too poor to participate in a market system that would allow them to purchase the goods and services that they want. And so I think the sector has really come a long way in terms of looking at this as a market, and that is going to unleash, I think, a lot of economic potential from the bottom up to meet this infrastructure investment from the top down.
Yeah, and the big intersections, I remember going in to meet with the foundation, it was 10 years ago, and I spent I spent 90% of the time talking about a water crisis that they knew nothing about, and 10% talking about solutions and responses, and part of that was the awareness part. Which I think everybody knows that there is a water crisis and there's much more relevancy today. So, I mean, huge changes, and that what I want to get to throughout our session here is how have these changes kind of either merged or diverged in funding and collaboration and solutions. But did you guys want to chime in? What have you seen?
So I mean, I think in terms of those dynamics that Gary was talking about, then it's important to recognize the important changes that have occurred over the last 2 decades or so and will occur over the next 20 to 30 years. So if you look at the pace of urbanization in Africa, for example, there's around 400 million people that are in urban environments in Africa. The expectation is by 2050 it'll be 1.2 billion. So presently, those cities cannot cope with the pace of urbanization. So the services don't exist, and it's not even, from lots of city planners' point of view, they haven't even contemplated where they would put those. And the new cities that need to grow to respond to that demand that I just described, they're not planned. People don't know where they will be placed. And if you look at cities that are growing very fast, like Lusaka, like Nairobi, then you can often see urban areas where the planning system cannot keep up with the pace of change that's occurring. So there's a really significant role that social entrepreneurs, hybrid organizations, NGOs, governments need to play together in terms of responding to that dynamic. And I mean, one of the things that Eleanor was just talking about in terms of innovative sanitation models, which is certainly one of the areas where we work as well, and there's good potential for collaboration between the two organizations in terms of that, is trying to put forward potential solutions with respect to what could happen in those situations where major infrastructure is not going to occur. So in most of the urban environments in Africa, cities typically have sewage systems for around 10 to 15% of the population, as Gary was mentioning, the rich folks. So what other solutions exist? And if it's going to be a mechanism for safely transporting that waste from the point of creation, I should say in one of the other events I was on Tuesday, I did talk rather graphically about human waste and sort of turned a few stomachs. So I'm trying to be a bit more diplomatic in this description. There's a few folks in the audience that were there. I think they remember my description. But anyway, but from the point of creation, then how do you then safely transport that waste through a system to the point of treatment and reuse? And it needs to be safe, economical, sustainable, but we need to consider all of the aspects connected to that. Not only the reality of that service provision, so that the quality, the price point for those individuals that are accessing and paying for those services, but the public policy implications. So what's the leakage of fecal material into the environment? How do we deal with that? And then how do we most effectively try and support the municipal treatment facilities? And we need to work all the way along that service provision, that value chain, to try and add value. And I think because we've got organizations, Gary's organization clearly works very much from a demand side, not exclusively, but you've clearly got lots of activity there. We come from a supply side. There's a real possibility then to build collaborative action in terms of responding to those dynamics.
When you also described a hugely complex, the urbanization level and the demand for managing the inflow and the outflow. And with an engineering background, and then also, now with Water for People. I remember 10 years ago that there was lots of talk about silver bullets. Okay, you can tweet $10 and drill a well. It's not that easy. How are we going to? So how are we going to fix these systems? We saw a really simple systems map in these urban areas, and also just even coming from an engineering side or a social structure side, how are we going to make these connections? It's complicated.
I'll give an insight, which I think will also be true for Gary and Neil, but we'll see. But we're mostly, as I said, in rural areas. And we're 25 years old, but we completely blew ourselves up a little over 5 years ago and kind of entirely changed how we work, which before was more traditional. We were lucky to be born in the US, so we'll go save the world and we'll do it ourselves. We'll bring our volunteers and we'll go build something and we'll move on to the next. And we absolutely know that doesn't work. So our change really empowering local communities and giving them a voice, especially the women, which we know is by far the most impacted by water and sanitation. And having those, that self-interest, working with local leadership. We find the mayors that really get it and they want to make this part of their legacy, even though our programs are more than a mayor term. So this is really important for my community to get healthy, educated, and develop economically. And then finding those national leaders who say, yeah, this is in my top 10 priority. And that whole change, I think, what we believe Water for People really begins with empowering the people who are going to benefit from this, but everybody benefits in the end. And that's a big change in how we work, and that's much more systems-based and again, sustainable service, not just pumps and pipes in the ground, which is easy and great, but the easiest part by far.
Yeah, great. Again, thinking about questions, but I want to talk about collaboration in the space, because I also remember seeing the just in a sense, fierce competition. You would have wells being drilled by different organizations. It was almost like almost like the oil industry in a way. But no, we're here first, and we're going to provide water to this community. Was that a problem? And there was a lot of go it alone. You guys blew the organization up, in your words, 5 years ago.
Well, that's not over yet. That still happens.
It is? Oh, okay.
And then we pick up a lot of abandoned infrastructure that we rehabilitate in part of our programs too, because we look at much bigger areas than little communities, dozens and hundreds and thousands of communities. And a lot of it's old from the,
So give me a little story, an example of what we were talking yesterday. There was a silver bullet project. I guess it's been written about a lot, but something called play pumps, which was a wonderful idea for a short little film. Kids run it on a merry-go-round, which ran a pump, which pumped water up, and it was going to solve the world's the rural water challenge. And there is actually a play pump graveyard.
There is indeed, and hopefully it'll just go away someday. But play pumps was also. A lot of times women would go there. Well, they didn't have the kids, right? So they had to get the merry-go-round going to get the water. It didn't work.
It wasn't fun.
And it wasn't, the great idea didn't come from that community, right?
Right.
Yeah, I got that. This is what we need, a play pump to get our water.
Well, in the sector, it spent decades trying to focus in on just a couple of really robust pumps, like the India Mark III, Mark IV, the Akfordov, that really would eliminate the supply chain problems because you have all these different pumps.
Spare parts.
And so all of that was focused, UNICEF worked on that, lots of folks worked on that to really get the standardized, and all of a sudden you drop in a completely new kind of pump and hoping that's going to become the standard just because you have a film, right? And so it just didn't work from that perspective because the breakdown wasn't there, the supply chains weren't there. So.
But it's also, it's recognizing the context in which those services are delivered. So if you purely think about the need of the poor, which of course from a very human aspect is something that everybody would want to do. But if you just think about that, then you're not considering the long-term sustainability for the system. So putting in a bunch of boreholes where you haven't considered the economic reality of how that service is delivered is just in the long run not going to work. So there's a need to recognize the context within which that service delivery is created. And clearly you've got urban-rural dynamics, but in some way, someone needs to pay for that service. And there's a whole bunch of models where consumers will pay for that. There may be other models where governments pay part of that process, or there may also be cross-subsidy models that are economically viable. But it's critically important to work at both the public policy and then also the business model angle. And so to try and stimulate that activity, there's a need to work on both sides of that. And I think it shouldn't be seen as an either-or. There's a requirement to ensure that both of those pieces are functioning successfully.
Yeah, and Eleanor, you mentioned the things that last longer than the mayor's term. How do you build that? It's a level of, is there a checklist that anyone working in the social entrepreneur world, whether it's water or whether it's any other sort of product or service in these communities, there are ways to approach it. Again, back 10 years ago, it was send $10 and drill a well.
Well, actually, we are just developing a checklist, but it took us a long time. But it's more the checklist that we are focused on is the checklist when we can leave. Okay. So that's of course part of our mission as well. So what services? How do we maintain that level of service, and what is this is how we transition out.
But I mean, right, so here at Skoll, lots of people talk about systems change.
Right.
So there's a real desire to get a system to function, which is great. But then you need to unpack that in terms of thinking about, well, so what does a functional system mean? What does that look like? What are the characteristics of that? And how do we know when we've got to that point? And so one of the things we're trying to do is to unpack the process of a functional water system so that we recognize that. I would imagine that your checklist responds to that in some way. So I think we should definitely talk regarding that. Sounds good. But it's one of the aspects that we've been teasing out with a number of our supporters, because of course we say we're ultimately driving towards that point, and we have a theory of change that gets us to that. But if we don't understand the characteristics and the reality of that endpoint, then of course we're not necessarily driving all the way to make that happen.
You don't know when you get there.
And I think, as you were speaking, one of the things that really popped into my head was that You were talking about the one term of mayors, for example. There's a real need to understand the drivers for why certain actors in this system will take certain decisions. And of course that runs from government to regulators to utilities to other actors. And it's not just the most obvious driver there. There's all sorts of reasons. There's egotistical reasons, there's political positioning, there's there's their own personal take on it, etc. And it's important when you're trying to influence a set of actors how you to respond to all of those dynamics. And I mean, sorry, don't.
No.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, I think that a couple of different directions my mind go in. One is this collaboration concept and the thought of horizontal versus vertical collaboration. And I think that, when you come to Skoll, there's a lot of us that look fairly similar. We each have a little bit different take, and that's the kind of horizontal collaboration. I think we're doing some things with that for sure. But the vertical collaboration is where we've been historically focused more on. Like, how do we find different actors that would be unexpected to really complete this chain of getting water services to the poor? And so, we didn't go out and create a bank with Water.org. What we did is we found those microfinance institutions around the world that already have a banking relationship with the poor, and did kind of that vertical collaboration with them and bring them together. Now we have about 50 MFIs that actually have dedicated loan portfolios for water and sanitation services at the base of the pyramid. And once we've done that and built this evidence base to convince government, now we have over 3.4 million people who've got access to water and sanitation because of loans as opposed to charity. So now you go more vertical with government, like in India, where they have the Swachh Bharat, where everybody in the country is supposed to get a toilet by Gandhi's birthday in 2019. That's a long road to travel. But if we are working with governments at the national and state level there, to say, hey, don't think of all of those people who need toilets as needing subsidies. Think of them as customers, and here's the evidence base for how we've reached millions of people in your country, and then incorporate this into your planning. And so we're getting a lot of uptake in that vertical direction as well. So I think that and then on the horizontal, of course, we're sharing a lot of things back and forth now with kind of our methodology and giving you guys more insight into the MFIs that are operating in your area, and that kind of horizontal collaboration can happen as well. So I think I see it kind of going in those two directions.
So I mean, and that's a great example. So obviously you guys are clearly working from the ground up in terms of trying to stimulate the demand, which would sit within the context of the Swachh Bharat, the Clean India Initiative. We're technical advisors to the Clean India Initiative, so it's a massive India-wide initiative. As Gary quite rightly said, there's no way that they're going to hit the targets by 2019. India will not be defecation-free by that point. But there is a need to help the cities and the states and at the federal level in India to think about alternative solutions. So our role is to pick up solutions that have worked in different contexts and help feed them in at various kind of testbed states. So at a city level, and then work with the Ministry of Urban Environment to get them to consider that. So what we should actually work on is how do we close that gap better? Because if we're trying to get them to consider a bunch of different possibilities, you guys are obviously inputting then in terms of the reality of consumers engaging with that. So there is a clear and obvious trajectory there for how we should try and collaborate to push forward the quality of the system.
And just real quick, I think that trying to create the things from the top down, the infrastructure and the systems is really important. But I think also kind of our perspective is there's a lot right now that we can do to bring the poor into the system as it exists, as lousy as the system is, right? So we don't want to wait until that's all fixed, until we can let the poor come in and get connected to the utility. I mean, the problem is that there are a lot of poor people who would connect just like, the five-star hotels in the rich neighborhoods to this grid because it's there, but they simply don't have the $200 it takes to pay the connection fee. So let's get them engaged in the system as it is from the bottom up. And that gives them, the government and the utilities, more courage to build out the infrastructure. If they know that there's paying customers out there that's drawing it towards them, then they will hopefully invest in that infrastructure.
Sure. So I would agree with you regarding the fact that you want more consumers to engage with that process, but and you want to encourage them to do that, absolutely. But then there's a need to consider the capacity of those institutions, so the utilities, in terms of how they can effectively respond on to consumers. And that can quite often be a block or a challenge. So breaking that down, helping them understand a bunch of different ways that they could structure the fee, the connection fees that you were discussing, is also a really useful way of ensuring that poor people can access those services effectively.
Yeah, and it's not, of course, it's not either or. It's a yes and, but I think it's that's kind of where we came at it from. We had this epiphany, 10, 12 years ago. That's like there's never going to be enough charity in the world to get water and sanitation to everyone. That's the bad news. The good news is like there's all of this capital swirling around the base of the pyramid being spent really inefficiently. So instead of like going to the UN and saying we need another $100 billion to like give away water, it's like, you light the candle instead of cursing the darkness, and you go down there and you start to catalyze it from the bottom up. And I think to me, that's one of the most exciting things about the sector, because there is more happening from the top down and that supply push, but there's also this incredible demand pull. And one of the things that bothers me a lot is when people say, but if you connect all those poor people, the water system's already stressed. How can you be going out advocating, more people get connected? And it's like, if you look at the fresh water extractions that are happening around the world, it would only take 1% of those extractions to get the basic water service to everyone who needs it at the base of the pyramid. Now, the water's not always where the people are, but that gives you an illustrative example. You increase agricultural efficiency of water use by 2%. That gets water to everybody in the world, right? So it's a false dichotomy there.
Yeah, but I mean, sorry, go on, Eleanor.
Yeah, I just have on the collaboration item, you mentioned the broad. I find this really exciting, so I want to make sure we touch on it. So coming in again from more of a for-profit perspective, coming to the space and finding all these, an NGO every day, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so inefficient and crazy. What is this? So I really believe in one thing we're trying to do. We're working together with both Gary and Neil on this, just bringing together NGOs in the water space, and we also have WaterAid and IRC and Agua Consult and funders, and Lewis is here from the Osprey Foundation. Let's be more efficient in what we do, and let's all do what we do really good, and let's do our thing, but let's make sure we know what each other's doing so we don't have to repeat and be inefficient. And where we work in the same places, let's coordinate and be stronger together as opposed to just operating in silos. And I believe, convinced this is a more impactful way and a better use of money and more impact in the end. So we're starting this collaboration to really move faster and to move smarter and to help get to the
Yeah, so I wanted to ask about the checklist,
Yeah.
and about funding. So you have a checklist, so either our job is done, or we can now things are working, we've got the right political system, top down, bottom up, sideways collaboration, everything's queued up. Does that checklist align with what funders expect? Because metric, is that align with your funding network, or do you have to educate your funders?
Oh, that's a big question. I mean, yes and yes.
Sorry, loaded question,
so
double question.
It depends. There's all kinds of funders. Some would just want to know, how many beneficiaries got water last week. Then we're much more holistic, and we're really not. No, it's a sustained service. Last week is one thing, but we want them to have water forever. So it's much more about the institution building and the capacity building, which you can't put lots of numbers on, but it's core to that. So part of our role is to educate our funders. We'll do our best we can to do your counting, but really let's focus on what's going to happen in the future in this community. So we definitely, and then we have the whole range of where we are in that spectrum of understanding or wanting to understand or not. So we got the whole portfolio management.
Awesome, and just take a second to remind folks, if anybody has questions, held up a little Q&A, so remind questions. Has questions, raise your hand, and I can either try to throw this at you, or I can
Carl.
with you. We'll throw them together.
So,
but chime in. So
yeah. So I mean, just to add to that point, I just wanted to say, I mean, Gary mentioned this idea of that there's lots of capital that's looking for a home. I mean, water is definitely more advanced than sanitation, but if you look at sanitation provision for low-income consumers, particularly in emerging market contexts, there's a lot of money that is looking for a home. They're looking for profit, commercially viable models to invest into, and they're finding it incredibly difficult to find that place. So if you look at the Acumen's experience, for example, of trying to find those business models, they're really few and far between. And we're obviously working on a bunch. What people are working on others, but and there's a really very small number where you've managed to crack that. But if we can advance the system to the point where we have a greater, better, scalable solution, then I mean, clearly that would be a huge contribution. But there was certainly a thought at least 3 to 4 years ago that some of the silver bullet solutions in terms of technology were going to respond to these questions. And what you can see is that technology has not advanced as fast as folks hoped, and also the technology does not sit effectively in markets in the way that people believed. So the market and the consumers didn't respond to that technology in the way that had been expected. And so that creates a whole series of issues and challenges in terms of business models. So there's a real need to invest long term into thinking about these questions, and that capital either needs to be patient or the role of funders, so the role of Skoll and others who are investing into that is incredibly important in terms of creating that possibility to drive forward questions of how you develop effective business models.
Yeah, Yuri, you want to chime in?
Well, I think that supply push, because I mean, you have the water.org URL, everybody sends you everything about this pump or that filter, and we get it a lot, and it's all comes from a good place. You know, people really want to help and make a difference, but that kind of supply driven approach doesn't work. It's demand, right? I mean, I can tell you, there's 700 million people in India who don't have toilets. A lot of them, probably more than half, know exactly which toilet they want to buy in the market. They go buy and say, "Boy, I wish I had the money to buy that toilet." But it's there. The water pipes are there in the ground. It's like, God, I wish I had the $200 so I could pay to get connected like my neighbors do. So we really, to me, it has to be, thinking about as this demand begins to exert itself, we do have to think about these supply chains. We've got to invest in businesses and small and medium enterprises that serve the base of the pyramid, but there's so much pent up demand and so much market, supply serving that right now, that can happen right away. And I think that's the key with the whole concept, and I know I keep harping on this, but our vision is like capital being ubiquitous and affordable for the base of the pyramid so that they can go out and get these. Because you think about a toilet to them is like, for us, almost like buying a new car, right? And how many of us do that without having a loan, right? And that's kind of what the folks are facing. And I think that's what we're trying to unleash.
And one thing we spend quite a bit of time on is getting all those hardware stores from the city all the way out to our farthest community have those toilets, have it the supply, and have it affordable. That whole supply chain is, it's hard.
And those guys need capital too. And I think that's
they need a supplier.
Right.
And that's we've raised our first fund of 11 million in equity that we're deploying now with microfinance institutions in India as debt capital. And now in the fall we'll start raising a $50 million fund in the U.S. and Europe that will provide a financial return to investors that can also then be invested not just in the microfinance institutions, but in those enterprises. So we're expanding that remit of that fund so it can invest. If you guys are out there trying to create these businesses or stimulate them and they're capital constrained, then we can find those investment channels.
But I mean, so would completely agree that access to finance clearly is one thing that drives demand. There's a bunch of other dynamics, and you want to look at the supply and demand relationship. But if you look, for example, in Ghana, there are technically regulations that say that all compound sanitation facilities should have all compound facilities where most poor people live should have sanitation facilities, whether that's a latrine or some other form of toilet. But most landlords who own those facilities where poor people live completely ignore those regulations. And there's no system that supports that. So we're working then to both through encouragement and then also through greater penalties to encourage landlords to comply. Then you create demand, and obviously when you've got that demand, what you want to do is to have a high quality supply chain so that if they're going to go out and invest, then they're able to access some good quality materials. So it's about working through both of those. together with the piece that you were
Yeah.
describing in terms of access to finance.
Which is why we need the fierce collaboration
Yes.
like, between us, right? It's like, boom, you know, it can be, you know, a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
So,
Fierce
Yep.
collaboration, Tenacious Water. Did you want a question?
Hello, I'm Emily Filou. I'm a journalist and I write about water issues and wastewater. And I had two questions about things that were alluded in the conversation. The first one was Eleanor, you mentioned sludge management and how that could be turned into a business opportunity, how that could be sold as, I imagine, as fertilizer. Biogas might be pushing it. But I was wondering how exploiting the commercial element of sludge management might offer some new solutions to generalizing wastewater access, to promoting wastewater access, because wastewater traditionally has been seen as just a drain on finances. It's expensive. No one wants to pay for it. But if there's a revenue to be made from it, that might change the status quo. And the other question I had was about agriculture. Gary, you mentioned, of course, the biggest waste comes from agriculture. So I was wondering to what extent you are working with, agricultural players, be they ministries or farmers, to try and see how the wastage, the inefficiencies in those systems can be alleviated, which might in turn make access to scarce resources easier for drinking water.
mm-hmm.
So to make sure I understand your sludge question, are you asking if we should promote sewer so we can get the sludge so we can make products for resale?
I'm just wondering whether, be it a centralized or decentralized system, how if sort of getting revenue from sludge treatment, either because you turn it into a fertilizer or because you get biogas from it, whether the fact that might turn into revenues might make it easier to finance sanitation systems.
Okay, yeah. Yes, if you can get revenue out of the end, you can have it much more, the feasibility study is much more quicker to get moving because there is a profit at the end. So you can get the same product out of a wastewater plant or a sludge treatment plant. If you have a sewer, you're just putting a lot of water. It's nice and convenient because it moves it all the way, but then you got to take all that water out. So putting water in, taking water out is huge energy, huge cost, and where we work, especially, there's water scarcity issues. I'm a sewer person, so I love sewers, but this is not necessarily the solution for where I'm working today. Sludge, if you can empty the pit and you don't put water in there, I mean, there's some liquid in there, unless it's separated at the source, that is much better product to start with, because it's much more efficient, that process, and then you can really, biogas isn't that hard to get out and it has a value. You can have that power the plant, and you can get your product with a higher solids content, much better product at the end. So these decentralized plants we're building in towns that are really focused on getting that sludge into the sludge treatment plant, I think it's a really amazing opportunity, and it could be.
To what extent do you actually see it happening? Because I know the theory, but I'm wondering how much it's actually working, sort of whether that is.
It's not super prevalent this time. We're doing it in Uganda specifically, and we're hoping to, this is part of our next 5 years, to really do it in a lot more places where we work.
But just to add on to that slightly, so I mean, if you're creating a bunch of products out of that waste, then you need to consider what's the market that those products can reach, and what's the additional cost for getting that product to market. So if you're creating fertilizer, I mean, it clearly depends when they're located, but if you're creating fertilizer in an urban environment, which may be typically used for an agricultural production, there's always going to be an additional transport cost to get it there. If you're creating energy from the biogas, then of course the question is where is the energy used? And the models that work most effectively is in a situation where you can use that energy directly in the same geographical location, because obviously piping biogas or bottling biogas is pretty expensive. If you look at situations in developed markets where this works effectively, then you can see UK wastewater companies are using human waste as a source of energy for their water treatment plants, but it's precisely because they're physically located in the same location. So there is a significant cost saving in terms of doing that.
One other thing with the sludge briquettes, sorry Gary, we are selling briquettes to compete with charcoal, much better heating value, longer burning, less sparking. We have all these advantages, but there are a lot of people who won't buy it if they know really what it is. So then there's the huge education component on, we're using mostly for industrial uses in the local communities. But we went through this in this country too, using biosolids for fertilizer. There is a education process to get that accepted, but it's a great fuel. We can make that happen.
And you asked about the agricultural issue. So yes, there needs to be like really serious policy reform to, as Carl has mentioned, give free electricity for farmers to pump water. So that's a huge macro issue with respect to water resource management. And frankly, we don't focus on that in terms of policy change. I mean, when we work with government and collaborate on policy change, we worked with the Reserve Bank of India, for instance, to reform the way that they treat water and sanitation under their microfinance regulations. So we got water and sanitation to be part of their priority sector lending, which meant that MFIs could source capital at a lower cost to go and make these loans. And we use that evidence, the fact that these loans are repaid 99% of the time, and built that into that pitch to them so that we could work on those types of policy reforms.
Other questions? Yep, you can toss if you dare. All right, excellent.
Good assist.
Good.
I'm Jason Bobie, and I'm also a journalist. I'm with National Public Radio. Eleanor, I'm very interested in your checklist, your exit checklist. Like, what is that? And also, I'm wondering about how much of it relies on just there being, is it that you expect that there would be an open free market that's going to take care of all of this? Because, if you look in the US, you look in Europe, water and sanitation is heavily a government priority. It's done by the government in most places. And what is your vision of what it's going to be like in these markets that you're working with when you leave?
Okay, and I might call on my colleague Nick, who actually made the checklist, who's over here, so you can start thinking about it. So we have two checklists, the water checklist and the sanitation checklist. The water is a utility checklist. So are the utility structures in place? Is there government? Is there municipal water and sanitation office? Is the level of services being sustained? Is there good water quality? All those things that are the same that you would have in here in the UK or in the US. The sanitation checklist is much more business focused on supply. Some of the things we talked about, is there financing available? Is there supply chain? Can we get people have them be able to buy their toilet as easily as possible? So that is more a business focused, market based checklist. I don't know, Nick, if you want to add anything.
Oh, can we toss? Oh, yeah. Or here's.
That's right. You were pretty good.
There's one right. There's. Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Respond very briefly. The only thing I would add to what Eleanor said, I think for exiting the finance and where that long-term finance is going to come from is one of the crucial pieces. So that is a question of, is the balance between users and public finance essentially capable of meeting the needs of the system and then being sustained over generations? And obviously that's very contextually specific, depending on relative wealth of governments themselves and different layers of government, and obviously of the users of those services. So more challenging in Africa for sure, than less in Latin America, where we are working and can see the potential for exit much sooner than we can in Africa.
But in terms of the broad point, which is the role of public finance to pay for capital investment, for example, yes, absolutely. If you look at the development of systems in the UK, Europe, US, then it was critically